Welcome everyone. My name is Katherine Sundermann and I'm a director at MGS Architects and also Vice President at Urban Design Forum. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we meet today, the Wurundjeri Willem, and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it's so important with any conversation around the form and format of our cities that we really engage with that deep connection to country that our First Nations people have, and engage with Indigenous knowledge systems, ensure that they must inform how we go on to think about the future of our cities. Today, we'll be talking about the future of Victoria and Melbourne suburbs, a topic that I would assume most people in this room will have both a professional and personal interest in. We all know that Melbourne is going to grow to 8 million people by the year 2050. But it was interesting today, I did some quick stats about how many homes we have at the moment and how many we're going to grow by. We currently have about 2 million homes in Melbourne, and we're going to add 1.5 million homes in the next 27 years. So that's so interesting to think about how we've taken this long to get 2 million homes and we're going to add another 1.5. But what form and function, how does that look and feel? What is this actually going to be like? Are we going to live in high amenity, walkable neighbourhoods, close to public transport, jobs, social networks? Or are we going to continue to sprawl and live in a way that you're very dependent on cars and that public infrastructure and public services can't keep up with private investment? Well, the idea of limiting sprawl has been around since at least about 50 years. If you think about Rupert Hamer and his focus on the green wedge, limiting development there. And certainly when I was at architecture school, Melbourne 2030 was the latest thing, introducing the urban growth boundary. But it's really only been this last year that government has really doubled down and committed to developing 70% of all new housing within existing urban areas. And there's been two main crises that they're really responding to with that. The first is a housing affordability, and I know again it's affecting many people, including people in this room. And that's of course driven by interest rate increases and also skills and material shortages. But it's also very much influenced by the true cost of sprawl to government in terms of the cost of infrastructure provision, and also the true cost to us all of having those living environments. But where does this leave us? We know that intensification is a good thing, but what will it be? Where does it happen? How will it actually happen? And given how entrenched greenfield development is in terms of how we shape our cities, will it actually change? Will anything change? In order to find out, we've brought together an incredible panel here today, and I'll introduce them very briefly. So next to me I've got Jonathan Spear, CEO of Infrastructure Victoria and Director of Melbourne Forum. Under Jonathan's stewardship, Infrastructure Victoria has grown its influence and commitment to the provision of expert evidence-based policy and reform advice in support of improved social, economic and environmental outcomes for the state, and was behind some of those reports about how much cost it is to government about the true cost of sprawl. Then we have Dr. Katherine Brown, CEO of Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, Board Director of Impact Investing Australia and the Australian Environmental Grantmakers Network. Through her work with Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, Australia's largest and oldest community foundation, Katherine focuses on the big social and environment issues of the day, especially affordable housing, climate change and economic inclusion. Next up, we have Rob Papaleo, who's the National Director of Build to Rent at Colliers. And in that role, Rob leverages his understanding of linkages between market forces, policy, and a range of economic, financial, and demographic factors with development and investment opportunities across build to rent and residential markets. Finally, we have Rob McGauran, Founding Director of MGS Architects and Board Member of Lord Mayor's Charitable Foundation, Homes Melbourne and Southport Community Housing Group. Rob is also Adjunct Professor at both the University of Melbourne and Monash University, And Rob is well known for his practice, research and advocacy regarding affordable housing and urban transformation. Okay, let's get stuck into it. We'll have time for Q&A as well towards the end, so make sure to think of any questions that you have. Let's start with a simple one. The Victorian government is committed to a target of having 70% of all housing within existing urban areas. Why do they have this vision, and what are the benefits to this approach? Perhaps, Rob, if you wanted to kick things off.
I think, and Jonathan will no doubt have a view on this, and Katherine as well, but the way the nature of work is changing, the environmental imperatives we have, the evidence that we've got around the benefits of proximity in delivering services, accessing jobs, and leveraging public money investment in infrastructure well, all support the proposition, as well as obviously protecting our food areas of cities and locations as well, and the planet more generally. So, in essence, that's why.
Great. That sounds good, Rob. I'm interested, Jonathan, I know that you had that report in 2019 that talked about the cost of sprawl to government. What exactly did you see in that?
Yeah, so we looked in 2019 at the comparative costs of delivering infrastructure in different development settings across Melbourne, so in established areas and greenfield areas were really what we were looking at. And we're trying to get it down to sort of almost an itemised cost. So what does it cost for an additional house in an established area versus a greenfield area? And what we found was that it cost up to 4 times more, between 2 and 4 times more, to deliver the sort of infrastructure that a new home needs in a greenfield area, because you're putting in always new trunk infrastructure as opposed to incrementally upgrading it. Now, the couple little kind of riders to that, which is that we didn't count some of the big chunky transport infrastructure costs, which would add a lot more if you did that. But also they have benefits across the whole transport network. They're not necessarily house by house, but that's a reality of the sort of costs that we face as a community to make those suburbs livable. And also, as we have greater density in established areas, we do have to keep an eye on the cost of delivering some of the social infrastructure or the community infrastructure and open space, because that's the other challenge about making sure that with density we get those sort of services still, when it means you can't necessarily deliver the same scale of open space, for example. You've got to be a lot smarter than that. So they're if you like, the riders to that 2 to 4 times more expensive, but that's kind of what's at play here. But then in addition to what Rob's talked about, when you look at, well, what's at stake at a more macro level? Well, denser cities are economically more productive. Really good evidence of that around the world. And if you stay tuned for a few more months, you might even see some more evidence of that published here. Spoiler alert. Similarly, when it comes to accessibility, so the social benefits of accessibility to jobs and services, for example, compact cities tend to do better. And environmentally, compact cities tend to do better, again with a little rider, that compact cities can have quite big embedded carbon emissions in them if we don't change our ways in terms of the materials and design for both housing and the infrastructure to support them.
Could I, maybe on that point there around your assessment of 2 to 4 times more expensive, can I be the devil's advocate and ask whether there was actually any assessment of the opportunity cost of development in those greenfield areas and what is actually lost on the way through?
Probably useful to talk about what do you mean by opportunity cost in that. So what are you thinking of in terms of opportunity cost that's gained or lost there?
The loss of productivity in that land that might be for other purposes, for example.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things we absolutely, and this is studies around the world are showing, is the loss of open space biodiversity and productive agricultural land as we sprawl on the edges of our cities is certainly one of the things that we need to take into account. Absolutely, Rob. Yeah.
Katherine, did you have any other points? I know it's been pretty comprehensive so far.
Yeah, that has been comprehensive. Because we fund in affordable housing, economic inclusion and climate change, we're starting to see all of these issues more and more intertwined. So when you talk about food and the urban fringe, we've funded the Food Print Project, which is here at the University of Melbourne, now in the School of Geography, for about 8 years, and they've mapped Melbourne's food bowl, and they made a submission to Melbourne 2050, and that started to protect some of the outer urban areas where the market gardens are so critical, because that's part of our sustainability as a city, is that we have food. We've got a good food bowl at the moment, but it's got risks. So we would look at that. And then in terms of the, it's about the sort of life opportunities you get where your house is. So there's no point in having affordable housing just anywhere. You need to be located near public transport, near open spaces, as Jonathan said, near services, jobs, schools, health services. So all of that is incredibly critical. Yeah.
That's great, Katherine. It's a really good segue to my next question, which is that, while we have this target of 70% of new housing in existing urban areas, what form does it take? So we know that there can be redevelopment of former industrial areas into more apartment precincts, or more kind of incremental transformation of post-war suburbs. What will it look like to you, and also what should we prioritise? Rob looks keen.
I want to jump in here. So I think that the notion of established versus greenfield is very simplistic, and I would argue that within the established areas there's quite literally very distinct zones depending on the era of development. Because if we look over the last 30 years of urban development across Melbourne, the typology of lots probably don't allow for redevelopment to occur unless there's a fundamental shift in the way that we think about housing. A 400 square metre lot that's been typical, if not smaller now, doesn't really divide easily into two.
And so what should we be prioritising? I know we're wanting to build close to open space and transport, but what type of, as you say, there's many different types, what should we prioritise?
Sure, if that question's for me. But
I'll just say one thing. I've more and more been thinking about that we have to sort of talk about the neighbourhoods that we love, and they're all different neighbourhoods across Melbourne, and what do we love about them, and how do we infill in a way that doesn't lose, the soul of that neighbourhood. And so I think, I just as a case study personally, I live in Fairfield, and the first Nightingale village development was in Fairfield. And when it was started, I think we were all a bit sort of, what's this? But now that it's there and it's 4 stories, and the green is starting to grow down, and at the base of it there's a wine bar, and there's a garden design place and an ice cream shop, and it's all become sort of part of the neighbourhood, and it hasn't reduced amenity, I guess you could say. So I think that's sort of, I think Melbourne's a series of villages, so we have to kind of think about the beautiful aspects of every neighbourhood.
I'd certainly like to see more joining up of our thinking. Jonathan's group has done some very good work on what infrastructure is needed where, with maximum bang for the buck for the Victorian taxpayer. One of those, for example, is the light rail across to Fisherman's Bend's employment precinct. And then we need to think about how do we change these precincts that are monocultural to reflect the changing nature of work and the need for the workers who are going to be behind the success of those precincts, the talent that is needed to ensure that they can afford to be there. So whether that's Arden or Fisherman's Bend or the Monash precinct or the precinct around Heidelberg, Bandura and the health and university areas there, or Sunshine and that area of interchange with regional areas and suburban areas. I think there are areas where the Victorian people and the Victorian economy can get disproportionate benefit, and where we need to start to think about bringing, as we did in the 90s and early 2000s when a new form of developer came to the market building higher density housing, in that case for sale. Now we need more long-term players who are putting it into property portfolio, institutional investment areas as well, to complement those other markets, not to replace them, but complement them, because we need, as you're saying, so much scale and so much supply. You know, Ben's here from Stockland. We've got Jim from Wilbo here, long-term property players. We need to be seeing those groups having thousands of properties in a property portfolio for key workers and affordable housing near all of these services we thought about, but interested in other thoughts.
Yeah, so I think you've got some really good examples there from Katherine's very specific sort of local example, Robert's example about it being, it depends on the context across Melbourne and then those specific precincts. So let's go up sort of 100,000 feet. What's the scale of the challenge and the opportunity? So there's this aspiration for 70% of growth to be in established areas of Melbourne, 30% in the greenfields. Where are we at? We're at lower than 50% and going down. And when you look at regional cities, also like Geelong and Ballarat, they've got about a 50-50 aspiration, but they're not hitting that either. So that's if you like, where we're at in terms of the target. What we were interested in is understanding, well, why are people choosing to live in greenfield areas? Do they just not get it? Because to be honest, there's a sort of slightly patronising view that they just don't get it. So we went and talked to them. Whole lot of focus groups, and there's 6,000 people. And what they told us was that actually a lot of them are really taking considered decisions about where they want to live, and they want to live in a freestanding house in a greenfield area with a driveway and a car park and 3 or 4 bedrooms, and that's what they want. And they also want to see capital growth, they see as a form of investment. But there's a bunch of people who don't want that, but they're not getting given any other choice. And that's where the big opportunity lies, because about 1 in 5 households in Melbourne and about 1 in 3 in Geelong say, no, we don't want that greenfields dream. That's not our dream. We want to live in a medium density 3 or 4 bedroom townhouse or low rise apartment. And we would have that trade-off, but there's no stock. There's no supply. And so that's the opportunity in terms of how to unlock some of the rebalancing of the growth. But it also means that, well, not everyone's going to go and live in the established areas of our cities either. So we actually have to do development in all sorts of different contexts. And it can be a rebalance of where it is, but different types of opportunity and choice are really important. And I think that kind of goes a bit back to the different places and the different property types that we can deliver.
Personally, I think that a lot of the criticism of the greenfield areas from the planning profession is that it's so similar and so homogenous. And I think there's a real opportunity to think about the greenfields very differently, and where there might be an opportunity to start introducing these newer concepts of housing in these areas of differing density across a greenfield area, which has certainly been attempted through the PSP process. But what I was wanting to highlight is that the demand, which you were talking about through your surveys, is probably induced by the supply and the ease of supply in those greenfield areas at a relatively lower cost of production than what we're seeing in our historical infill areas. So how do we break that nexus, really, is the key question.
The other thing that's going on is there's some quite perverse financial incentives in terms of the way which first homeowner grant works and the way stamp duty works that effectively drives people to buy in greenfield areas too, in addition to all those other things that make it really easy and feasible to just replicate the same model over and again.
I think there's a couple of groups we should probably talk about specifically, and one is older women. So women over 50 are the fastest growing group of people facing homelessness in Melbourne. And if you think about where they want to live, and we've funded some research with CEFA which is Social Enterprise Finance Australia, about older women's housing and what people actually want. They want a safe and secure place, but they want to stay connected with their community, and a lot of them can't afford to. And so more and more in the paper recently, I'm seeing profiles of older women who can't stay near their families, near their friends, near their library, near their doctor, etc. And I think that's a very critical group that need to be catered for within the inner and middle suburbs. And then I think also the younger generation, Rob mentioned, students and key workers, they also want to be in the communities they know. And so, I think that's the other thing, and that's where the projects we've been funding in the affordable housing space are very much, in Preston. Now we have another site under development, being planned in North Melbourne, and then your work in Osnum House, which we also contributed, sort of kick-starting the philanthropy. That was about older women. So, we need to be really thoughtful about which groups we're actually trying to target. I mean, you want to keep those social bonds, because some of the other work we're doing in climate change and resilience, the most important thing is that people actually have those social connections. So when we have terrible heat waves and other things, the community can bounce back better.
I think the other thing I'd probably take issue with a couple of the points that were talked about earlier. The assumption that people are making these choices because that's what they want. I don't think they're getting full information all the time on that. So if I live in East Cranbourne, how many jobs can I access within an hour by public transport versus if I live in Carlton? And what does that mean for my family and my future family? And you've had people like Billy Giles Corty at RMIT basically coming back with the analysis that there is a high likelihood that your child will underperform at school, that your child will be obese, as will the rest of your family, if you live in certain areas of Melbourne. And we've got that now mapped. And that mapping's been consistent in supporting that thesis for the last 20 years. And people aren't getting that sort of choice ratings on their houses that they are on when they go into a supermarket, and you ask, why not? Like if you were being told your kid's going to be fat and dumb, at a very brutal level, but that's what essentially the research is showing. I mean, it's a dreadful outcome. And when we're getting told, we're going to build new big major activity centres on the edge of Melbourne, and we're not going to give them a train for 40 years, maybe. I mean, what sort of city are we thinking about if that's the trajectory? I mean, I think the developers who are going into those areas, like the areas that Katherine's been looking at in France, they're entitled to say, you want us to build a city here? Great. We need a station to go with it if we're going to have the jobs that this city will need to thrive.
No, I think there's so many good points, Rob, and I think what we've seemed to have established that this is something that we want, that we do want more people living in established areas. But I'd be really interested to hear what the barriers to that are. And I think we've heard some that actually there's overly intensification of greenfield development and that perhaps not every lot can be redeveloped. What are the other, what is the number one barrier from each of you in terms of why this is going to be a challenge, and how can it be overcome?
I mean, I can give one, and that is land. But to address that, we've actually shifted some of our grants to unlocking underutilised land owned by local government and not-for-profits and faith-based organisations for affordable housing. We've got a specific project on that. And we also funded this school here to develop the housing access rating tool, which maps Melbourne and shows where there's available land. And that actually, there's huge potential if you can assist people to think about their excess land differently, whether it's over a car park or whether it's a church that has space that's no longer needed. And in addition to the bigger capital projects we've funded, which we've partnered with the City of Darebin and the City of Melbourne, we've actually started funding feasibility studies, and organisations like a church, for example, or a not-for-profit, we've got a few examples now, they can get, professionals like you guys to help them plan what would be the best affordable housing they could achieve on that site. And now they're actually getting, we've got 3 of them now moving on to real projects. So sometimes it's just giving people the expertise to understand what's possible on the land that they own.
I mean, Katherine, with the research we did, we found 3, if you like, groups of problems as to why we're not getting that supply. So one is, as I mentioned earlier, there's these financial incentives that are driving people to go to greenfield areas more than they would otherwise. The second is just the ability to deliver more housing in established areas, the barriers to the actual delivery. And the third is the variety, the diversity of the housing that would particularly be housing that would meet the needs of a family, a sort of 3 or 4 bedroom sort of type house. And so you see things like, in addition to first home buyer grant and stamp duty being things of the way they work and the exemptions, is it makes people go to the greenfields to get those exemptions. The way in which the developer contributions have really patchy coverage and what they apply to doesn't really help. Then the eternal squabbles that developers have with existing area residents and councils without necessarily getting much better results in the end after lots of fun has been had in VCAT. So the lack of kind of clarity about planning settings, streamlining of that with some guarantees around quality. So particularly design quality and external appearance. Those are the things that when we talk to communities, and we have spent a lot of time talking to communities that have been through change of density, the quality of design and the assurance around that is the thing that they're genuinely concerned about. And so there's a real opportunity to streamline approvals combined with greater clarity on design requirements.
Can I add to Catherine's point? Because I think that where you're going makes a lot of sense. I mean, the easy response to your question, Katherine, was to just blame everything on planning, right? But I think the reality is, from my perspective, a lot of the issues are to do with the land development opportunities not actually sitting in the hands of those who can affect change. Too often you see lazy assets held by institutions, held by private families for whatever reason, who are enjoying that land for their particular purpose. And that is legitimate, possibly. But there is no mechanism that can, I suppose, support that land being transferred to an actor who can then convert that scarce factor, really, into something that is housing of its various types. And we see this particularly in the greenfield market with, long-standing farmers and probably more critically speculators rather than, real farmers who are just holding onto the land until the payday comes along. And they're being effectively rewarded.
So you say there's no mechanism. How could this be changed?
Do you want me to say it? Well, I reckon the government probably had a pretty good idea with GAIC in the greenfield market in its initial iteration, which was where it was going to be a vendor tax. And, through political pressure, that got watered down. And I know there'll be some who'll be saying it's a bad idea. But if you think about it holistically and across the whole city and from an economic and productivity for the city perspective, it's a shame that was changed. And look, maybe there are some issues with the proposed implementation, as you could argue with windfall gains tax applying to infill areas as well. Maybe that could have been executed a little bit differently. But I think in principle, I put my city's hat on, and I'm speaking on behalf of property developers, I'm not an apologist for them. I think that there is certainly some merit to that type of thinking.
I mean, my the biggest barrier I see is still the obsession amongst our policymakers in prioritising home ownership. My sense is that we've got a lot of home ownership in this country, but the needs of our city in the next 30 years can be most benefited by having great, affordable rental housing at scale. And that where the capital is at the moment in our society is also aligned with that if we get the right policy and incentives in place to ensure that we get alignment of that. So I'm sort of excited by that prospect, but I'm worried that both politicians and the press and many of the policy people in charge of the policies are still prioritising trying to think about how do we put more dead money into highly expensive home ownership at a time where we could be spending that money more productively for our cities.
And could we also think about shared equity and starting as a tenant and then moving to be an owner?
All of those things.
But there's lots of opportunities.
I still think they're good, but they're not as important as getting, if a third of our population is in rental accommodation, and in a whole lot of areas, 0.2% is affordable for rent in some of those markets, and none of it affordable in some of the areas for key workers who are driving the success of those places. You think it's a no-brainer to say we need the people who are going to help these cities be successful, be able to afford to live there.
Can I just refer to one anecdote from a meeting that I just came from literally half an hour before this session kicked off, where we were talking about a significant piece of land in the middle of an activity centre within one of Melbourne's designated innovation precincts, medical precincts, where there's a screaming urgency for more accommodation for key workers, nurses, whoever they might be. There is an existing permit which was achieved at, say, 5 levels. There is a proposed structure plan that will be introduced next year, limiting it to 4 levels. This development will not happen. In order to make a development feasible to create affordable rental accommodation, it needs to be 6. But there's this blinkered view that it's got to be 4 levels across the board for the whole activity centre, which to me is just craziness.
Interesting. So it sounds like there's lots of interesting ideas already, but I'm interested to hear as a final question before we open up to the audience. If you were Planning Minister for the day, what would be the one thing that you would do to ensure that the intensification of our existing suburbs is both possible but also positive for Melbourne? Jonathan?
Oh, I'm going to cheat. Watch this. So the one thing is to adopt all of the policy options and recommendations that we made in our Home Choices report. So that is remove first home buyer grant, review and phase out stamp duty over time, go and review all of the developer contribution charges and make sure that they apply across the city for all development settings, streamline planning approvals for houses, townhouses and low-rise apartments, medium-rise apartments with good quality as well, being embedded in that. Review mandatory parking requirements and lower them, and have a look at making sure that we've got more family-friendly apartment guidelines, and help out first home buyers with a shared equity fund rather than throwing money away with a first homeowner grant that doesn't actually improve the affordability of homes for first homeowners.
It's quite a list. Sounds great.
That's my one thing.
No, that's right. That was a good one thing. Katherine?
So one thing I feel is missing is that Melburnians can't see what a well-designed city would be, with more people. So I think if we could have a design competition for 10 neighbourhoods, say, and actually show people what's possible, and they could implement most of those policy and tax changes, and allow the community to sort of really understand what well-designed, and we haven't really talked about climate, but energy-efficient and climate-safe housing could look like in their neighbourhood, and that their amenity won't necessarily deteriorate, that, you know, they could have still a very livable suburb. I think that's very important, because you've got to get the yes in my backyard movement going. You can't just, because otherwise it's fear and people can't see where we're going to.
That is so true. And one of the things that we observed going around Melbourne is that there's very scarce examples to actually show people of exactly what you're talking about, Katherine.
Could I be cheeky? Some would ask me to make sure that as the new planning minister, I'd actually sign all the amendments and all the big permits that have been sitting on my desk for a little while. But apart from that, I'd listen to people like Jonathan in Infrastructure Victoria, who are the appointed experts, who are coming up with some really good ideas. Beyond that, I would certainly go back in time a little bit and reconsider what I thought was a really good policy at the time and still believe is a really good policy now, which is to allow, as of right, six-level development, subject to good design practice, of course, up and down every tram corridor of Melbourne and around designated nodes, with as the first point of planning policy.
Yes, I'd support Rob's last point. I think that's a logical one. I suppose I would be implementing a commercial 3-zone or similar in Fisherman's Bend, Monash and Arden, with a target for 20,000 homes, and go to the market saying you have a significant fund of money as a government to fund the gap to ensure that affordable housing is delivered in those locations in the next 10 years. And you're supporting Jonathan's business case for the tram and the trackless tram to those areas to back that investment.
So do we have any questions from the audience?
We know we've got lots of very informed people from industry here today, so we're really looking forward to you challenging us.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot. And I think we've touched on already this question, why hasn't the compact city been reality in Melbourne, even though we've been talking about that for at least 30 to 50 years in planning? And my question would be around, how do we bring people and communities along and change mindsets along, for example, the colonial settler society, where it is around developing, growing the city, as well as this dream of home ownership and this connection between house having land attached to it and the assets.
I would have thought we could have learnt a lot from the discussion on climate change and a lot around good food. And Katherine might want to put in some observations here from the work on working with the weather reporters. But the idea of giving people good information and full information so that they're making actually informed choices is what we have to do.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just briefly, we funded Monash Climate Change Communications Research Hub for quite a number of years, and talking to them still now about getting information from CSIRO and the Bureau of Meteorology together into easily digested charts, to show trends in weather and rain and so on. And that was then provided to weather presenters on Channel 7 and ABC first, but it's now expanded to others and even starting to go internationally. And I think if we could show people, again, it's about showing people in a mainstream setting, how Melbourne's going. We could have some great little data points, and we could be, every month we could see, how are we improving on our affordable housing in all sorts of ways? How's our 70% going? How's our renewable energy going? We've got lots of little targets, so we have to do a pretty fast transition, and I think that would help people start to see where Melbourne could be.
Yeah, and it's funny you say that, Catherine, because one of the key elements of our recommendations is that if we're going to get serious about where we're going to have infill development, we actually have to nominate the places. So at the moment, it's 70% in established areas, and that's being taken largely through very high density development in the centre of a city and around Stonington and so forth. And everyone else, and there's not necessarily criticisms going, I thought you were doing it. No, I thought you were doing it. Aren't you doing it? So actually what we've recommended is the Victorian government collaborate with local government to identify the places that are suitable for additional development. And some of it absolutely is along that sort of rail, tram and rail corridors, but some of it's also in other areas of a city. Nominate what are those places that are suitable for what types of homes and in what form, and then track progress over time.
That sounds great, Jonathan. I'm interested, especially tying back to the question. So we've got the target. We work with local and state government to work out where it should go. Should the community be part of that conversation too?
I think it's important that the community is part of the conversation, but it's at what point? I don't think the point where it's I get to object to everything that's being put up is the point. The point that the community ought to be engaged in is at the strategic planning point about so we are going to have more growth, we are going to have more population. Guess what? If we don't do that, then your kids aren't going to be living where they grew up. You're the sort of people Katherine was talking about aren't going to be able to live there, and the only choice they're going to have is on the edges of our cities. So let's talk about in this LGA what are the places that are suitable and what's the sort of urban form we want to see, and have the community involved at that stage. And then that feeds into the design standards which complement the streamlining.
It's really hard as a member of the community to actually have a say when you're going against the tide. I personally wanted to support an application for development in my neighbourhood. There was every form I had to fill in was all about why I wanted to object.
I find the community consultation issue very interesting, and I was watching Insight on Tuesday night, which of course was about NIMBYism, and I couldn't help but be struck by the thought that with such a unique opportunity that we have at the moment, we've got all but one government, and the country is Labor, so there should theoretically be a certain amount of cooperation with regard to that. But just a great opportunity for the general public to learn what development is. And there was a little bit of discussion about population growth, but most people don't, I don't think, understand why we even have population growth, why that's the driver of the economy that it is. I'm curious to know if the panel has any ideas about what might be suitable forums for the general public to be able to educate themselves better about what development is and just understand what all this dialogue's about, and to have early input along the lines that you were suggesting, Jonathan.
We've certainly been involved, Paul, in a number of, we did the Central Geelong plan, which had more 1.4 million square metres of additional floor space, Hobart, 1 million square metres, and being able to have to interrogate that to say what, where and why, and have those discussions with the community. We've found, whether it's there or in Banyule at Ivanhoe even, if you can personalise it to with people, in Ivanhoe we had the conversations about saying 2 scenarios, here's the map, this is what's changed in the last 100 years here. Put yourself in a situation where your partner has just had a hip operation, you're taken aside by the orthopaedic surgeon who says they're not going to be able to stay in the family home. They're going to need to go into lifted accommodation. It won't be built unless it's more than 5 stories in this area. Where would you be happy to live and see 5-story development for you for the future? And we got a whole lot of green dots on the aerial map, typically around the station in the activity centre areas, on car parks there. And we also asked, your kid's going to leave home at 19 years old, they're fearlessly independent, they go out late at night and they catch public transport. You want them to be safe. Where do you want a accommodation where they can not be walking down a suburban street, and they were happy to do that too, because it was making it easy for them to think about it through their lens of an alternative reason that is about them, and they were quite bold. So we got approval. It went from 800 objections on a previous scheme for 7-level development to 400 letters of support to the council and 20 objections to 7 and 8 level development in the same locations. But it was their story rather than my story. And so I think having that strategic discussion early, whether at a whole of Geelong area, like where should the health jobs growth be and where should the government services jobs growth be and where should the accommodation be, you can have those conversations and be very ambitious, I think, but you've got to actually get your storytelling right and your evidence right, and then people will come along board with you.
And it just needs to be mainstreamed. I mean, whether it's through online opportunities, through Infrastructure Victoria or wherever, or whether it's through the news or the 7:30 or Insiders or wherever it is, it needs to be where people go and are watching and without difficulty. Yeah.
Maybe on that point, I think people just need some time. Let's look at the people who don't have a lot of time to respond and engage. How do we actually reach them and get their opinions? Because they're probably the silent majority, I would think.
You're right. The other problem is actually the greatest beneficiaries of this are not in Australia or not even born yet. So that's the other thing we've got to have in mind, kind of to Rob's point.
I was going to say on the capacity building, THI and Jen Mitchellmore, it's really worth looking at the work she's been doing, which Kath knows very well as well, in helping communities through that process when there's not a flashpoint. So they're actually building the capacity longitudinally. That's not my question. I feel like we're getting into the territory of focusing on tactics, where I feel like all the lessons point to governance and point to institutions, of which I feel quite strongly we don't have the institutions to oversee this. Katherine, you spoke about Nightingale. We need 52,600 of those buildings to meet the target we're talking about, which is 1.05 million houses. What institutions are we missing to administer the land assembly required for this quantum of infill development?
I mean, there's one thing I think, we don't have a commission for Melbourne like they have in Sydney. There's not an entity for Greater Melbourne. And I think you've been doing a great job, trying to think about Melbourne and the regions. But it's very interesting in local government, that we have so many different local governments, so many different entities to deal with. It's complicated from a governance point of view. So, I mean, that's just my observation. I wouldn't say I have a solution, but we need a vision for Greater Melbourne.
And Rob spent his whole career on this, but we don't have a common land manager for government assets either. So you have a VicTrack who says their mandate is to store cars at railway stations or metal, but not people, for example. So that, and there's been previous times in my professional career where that's been quite different, where there's been governments. Kennett had a government that said use it or lose it to the government agencies. If you don't have a use for the land, we've got a use for the land, or we're going to sell it at that time. But to take your point, Andy, I think there's two things. What is the standard that we're aiming for? What is the framework for development for these places? And then what are the mechanisms to deliver it? I think we've got to make sure that we don't rely on government to do it all. The last 3 years has been an example with the big housing build. We've lost an opportunity by building Homes Victoria so big and not letting the private sector do more efficiently, in my view. And I think for us to be successful in meeting these targets, The private sector's got to do a lot of the heavy lifting in this space, and the new sectors that people like Ben at Stockland, who's here, are trying to put in place, or Marcus from Plenary, of large-scale institutional investment in this space has to be part of that solution too. And I'm confident in that case, you've got alignment. You've got alignment of quality, reliable income streams, etc., coming into play in a way that we don't have in our current settings. But it's not a full answer. The governance is going to be critical, and the accountability for delivering on targets is going to be critical if we're going to get there. You're absolutely right. And the quality of the outcomes and the measurements about what does that quality look like.
I'm going to be maybe a little controversial here, I hope, which is to say, yeah, governance institutions are really important, but actually we can sometimes get ourselves caught up in what's the best institution. There's a lot of discussions about, we should have a commission for Melbourne or whatever. Well, actually, the Greater Sydney Commission hasn't actually achieved all the things that they were intending to set out to do either. And so what the big opportunities before us over the next 12 to 18 months is that government's reviewing Plan Melbourne. And it's got a real opportunity to have a much clearer strategic direction backed up by policies that actually deliver it. And so what was different previously is that the 70-30 target and other things were aspirations rather than clear committed policy, and the policy mechanisms to actually deliver it weren't going to solidly do so. And so I don't think what we're talking about is just tactical. I think it's actually fundamental to delivering the outcomes that we want. So it's classic strategy about be very clear about what you want and have the mechanisms to deliver it, which we just haven't been doing. So yeah, governance is important, but let's not distract ourselves by working out what the form and functions of a Greater Melbourne Commission might be, when actually the main game is what are we trying to achieve and what are the policies to do it. Absolutely, over time there needs to be a capacity to deliver it and monitor it and see how we're going, but there's some really big opportunities right before us right now to change that are not rocket surgery.
And we've got time for just one final question.
I wanted to ask about suburban lots, middle suburbs, where subdivision's already well underway. Is that part of the solution? Is that being calculated into the future, or is this kind of a bit too tactical and not quite strategic enough? I'm talking lots, say, 500 to 600 metres squared.
There aren't that many 500-600 square metre lots being delivered. There haven't been for a long time. The reality is that most of the greenfield development that we're now seeing is probably tending towards 300 square metres.
Sorry, I meant existing stock, so middle ring suburbs.
Okay.
If that makes sense, sorry. So redeveloping, demolishing, whatever, yeah.
Yeah. So because of the scale of what we've got to do, that with our view is that that's got to be part of it. Now, it's not willy-nilly everywhere. That's where we kind of need to look at, well, where in each LGA are areas that are suitable. But those examples where you can have, say, it's pretty dilapidated stock, and you've got an opportunity to put, dual occupancy or something like that on it. Yeah, absolutely.
Could I just say, from a climate point of view, we have to be very careful we don't lose our greening, because, that's going to be such a critical issue. So, it's good we've got to always be thinking, like you said, right at the very beginning, about the green space, but also the trees on private land as well.
Yeah, there's one more from Ben that I'd like to hear too.
Oh,
Just had a question for Jonathan. There's obviously been some strong signals coming around housing strategy, due to come out in September, and rent capping possibly as part of that, given some strong signals in the press. In your research that you've done, have you considered rent capping, and what were your views on the effectiveness of that, globally?
The short answer is no, we haven't looked at rent capping. Now, primarily because the work we were looking at, or the problem we were looking at, or the question was people purchasing in greenfield areas what would it take to unlock them other choices. And so, which of course leads to a lot of solutions that are useful for not just greenfield purchases. We haven't looked at rent capping. From my reading, it's fair to say that there are a diverse range of views and evidence about the desirability and effectiveness of rent capping in the short and long term. But that's probably as far as I'd like to go, as we're an evidence-based organisation and haven't done detailed work on that. I suspect Robert might have a view, or he wants to share.
I'm raising the microphone here. I can just tell you from on-the-ground experience right here, right now, in the last couple of months, the very talk of this has frightened a lot of money away from considering investment, institutional investment, into housing that will actually lead to, higher volumes of new supply. That's pretty clear.
I don't know if Rob or Katherine have any final thoughts on that topic.
Sorry to get political.
No, I think, I would say that there's been a lot of discussions with government around the housing statement, and the indications I'm getting both federally and state is that a toolkit of initiatives is needed, not one simple, neat solution, and that for the first time at a federal level, the government is feeling that they're getting traction in talking with institutional money about partnerships in this space at scale, and so that was as late as Friday last week.
I know I did say there was only one question left, but I have a very persistent person at the back that would love to ask a question.
I was ready not to ask it. The decoupling of strategy and policy from the political cycle and the value of attempting to do that. I had a really interesting trip recently going to Copenhagen. I studied there in 2004, architecture. And on my recent trip, I hadn't been there for 20 years. And 20 years ago, I studied 2 major urban renewal precincts in Copenhagen. And I got to go back there 20 years later and see the results. And the results are incredible. One of them, Ørstad, gets a pretty bad rap on the ground over there. If we delivered something like that in Melbourne, it'd be winning awards, fair to say. But we seem to make plans and change them. And a city like Copenhagen still references the 1947 finger plan as though it was created yesterday. And they've changed it once, and that was for Ørstad. And it was a massive controversy. It seems to me that there is that issue with the political influence over this, over strategic and policy-based decisions that's limiting, say, Infrastructure Victoria's ability to do its job properly. Like Suburban Rail Loop was hatched in the back rooms at PwC, and Infrastructure Victoria didn't even know about it. So how is that creating a good city? How are we able to stop that sort of behaviour moving forward?
It's a great question. I'll start. So I don't think it's realistic or desirable for politics to be entirely taken out of infrastructure and land use planning, because we should have contests about what are we trying to achieve, what's good policy, who wins, who doesn't win. Those are all things that politics should be grappling with. What we want to do is make sure that the quality of the debate is high, both that we're debating politically and through in the community and the media, that we're debating the right things, that we're debating the issues that really matter, and putting forward evidence and policy options that are good options. Now, we're the independent advisor to Victorian Government and Victorian Parliament. It's for those who are elected to decide. They'll always take in a whole bunch of other inputs, right? Now, that's our role. And I think if you look back to where we were 8 years ago before IV existed, and you see the quality of the discussion that's happening now about planning and our city, it's a higher quality debate and higher quality options. Now, that's not all up to us. It's up to actually a coalition of stakeholders and researchers and community and media all pushing in that direction. And so I'd be interested when we look at Denmark, for example, or some of those other cities, what's happened over a very long period of time to get people to a consensus around what looks good, because that's kind of what we're trying to do, and that's the opportunity that's here now. Sometimes you see things and parties who are elected will make decisions where it's not what we or others have advised. That's life.
I think I heard a speaker from Finland a few years ago speaking about their approach to homelessness and their housing first approach. And it was basically, like you say, there was consensus, and no matter what a change of government, they continue to implement this long-term policy, which is very effective. So I think there's something about some stability in those really tough long-term social issues, having a policy that everybody can buy into and achieve. Yeah, it might be, planning's probably more complicated, but I think something like that could be done.
No, it's great. Good way to end. So thank you everyone for your attention and your questions today. I think I've certainly learned a lot about what incentives we have in place, and I think some of them that stand out to me is really taking away some of those incentives that support greenfield development. It's about that we need a range of typologies and types of development across our city and approaches to enabling them to happen. I think one really important point that came up today is really about taking community on a journey with this. So whether it is about public forums or other ways of engaging that are long-term and over-term rather than opposing certain positions that come up. And I think I'd really love to, I think a combination of Jonathan and Katherine's comments about really setting targets for housing in particular areas, and then involving local government, state government, and potentially also the community in terms of where that housing goes. And I loved Katherine's idea of the competitions for different neighbourhoods too, so that we can actually see what that might look like. So thank you for everyone, your contributions, and also have a look at the exhibition if you've got some time. Thanks everyone.